Hello, folks. Welcome to Bible study this week. We're going to be continuing our journey through this book, Overcoming Life's Challenges, Lessons from the Life of Joseph. And if you remember last week, we were at the point where Joseph's brothers had sold him into slavery, and now we're seeing what happened to him. Of course, as some of you have read the story in the Bible, you already know, but we're kind of analyzing what Joseph's actions are here and how they can help us through our times of trouble as well. Starting in the next chapter here, Overcoming Temptation, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. But it says, to say that life is filled with temptations is to have, as sportscaster Howard Cosell used to say, a marvelous grasp of the obvious. To realize, however, that the greatest temptations often come on the heels of great success is to understand the very essence of what makes life so hard. How we handle success says as much, if not more, about us as how we handle failure. This might seem far from Joseph's experience, but in fact it was to be his next great hurdle. Imagine being sold into slavery by your own family, no less, and dragged hundreds of miles away to a foreign land with foreign customs, foreign gods, and a foreign language. Those first days in Egypt as a slave must have been brutally difficult for this 17-year-old youth. Rather than becoming bitter, however, Joseph chose instead to bloom where he had been planted. Now, what does that mean? It's basically our version, that year's version of when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And so he says, I'm going to make the best of this situation. And this is the first thing I want us to get from this lesson is, even though Joseph was given a hard time, he was making the best of the situation. And so remember that. He learned the language and learned the skills, so that over the course of the next 10 years, he was given more and more responsibility until he was in charge of all his master's household. It must have taken hard work, great determination, and unyielding trust in his God. But Joseph devoted himself to the task at hand and became as successful as a slave could be. So, even though Joseph was a slave, it says he was thriving. And so, that's pretty good. I like this quote they have in here. It says, I can resist everything except temptation. And isn't that so true? So often, we get tempted by things and, it gets a hold on us and there's not much we can do about it. But, Joseph is making the best out of it. And you're going to see here, he really flees temptation at every cost. And so, as a result, Joseph would be challenged with success and the temptations it brings. And in learning to overcome these temptations, he would demonstrate that the lessons of God were starting to take hold in his young but maturing heart. This next section is talking about the power of testimony. It says, Joseph's life was about to take a fascinating turn. He had become the property of Potiphar, who was an officer of Pharaoh. Potiphar was captain of the guard. There's some disagreement among Bible scholars as to what that role was. Some say he was a warden. Others believe he was captain of the palace guard, and still others maintain he was captain of the executioners. What we do know is that Potiphar was powerful and wealthy enough to have many servants and slaves, and he had now added Joseph to his collection. But the point is, Joseph is not just another one of the slaves. Because of his testimony, Potiphar kind of excels him above the others. It says, as we have seen, Joseph distinguished himself in his role in Potiphar's household. But his skill and abilities were not what made the difference in his life. It was God's presence that made the difference. Genesis 39:2 says, the Lord was with Joseph. Imagine how painful Joseph's life must have been at that point. At age 17, he had been torn from his family and sold into slavery by his own brothers. How easy it would have been for him to become embittered and hate-filled like his brothers. But that didn't happen. Although Joseph was far from home and in difficult circumstances, the presence of God was very real in his life. So real, in fact, that his master saw that the Lord was with him. Potiphar could not help but recognize the presence of God in the life of this remarkable slave, and that had a dramatic impact on the Egyptian. Imagine how strong Joseph's testimony must have been for Potiphar, who was a pagan, not only to recognize and admire Joseph's character, but to attribute it to God rather than to Joseph himself. And this is kind of what I was talking about in the sermon Sunday. We just looked at what made the early church so great and what can make us great as Christians as well. Well, it was the fact that they let their testimony speak for itself. And sometimes you may get a few times where people wow, you can tell you're a really great person, but you don't get to, it's sometimes attributed to you. But some people say, there's something about that person. And I have been told, not to brag, that I have an infectious smile. And so, I kind of take pride in that. And so, I just try to smile everywhere I go because I'm like, if it's that infectious, let's infect everybody in a good way rather than what we're going through now. But here it says, the clear implication of the text is that Joseph was not bitter toward his brothers, nor was he enslaved by his circumstances. He was content in the presence of God. He didn't mourn his disappointment, but became useful where he was. And God used that heart of faithfulness and contentment. And Potiphar recognized God's presence with Joseph, and he made the young slave the overseer of his entire household. Joseph supervised all the other servants, handled public relations, oversaw finances, and was responsible for the provisions for the household. Valuable training for a later assignment Joseph would receive. And everything Joseph touched was blessed. Now, perhaps 10 years after being sold into slavery, Joseph was on top of the world. And now he was more vulnerable than ever to temptation. And so, what is that temptation? Let's get into it. Notice the closing words of Genesis 39:6. Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. He was good looking and well built. And now Potiphar's wife entered the scene. Her response? She cast longing eyes on Joseph. Potiphar's wife would have been right at home in modern American culture with its casual acceptance and approval of premarital sex and extramarital affairs. She had the same mindset. She was attracted to this young man physically and saw nothing wrong with offering herself to him. But Joseph refused her advances. He had a powerful set of convictions by which he lived, and he refused to be tempted by lust and desire. It seems obvious that these convictions were not learned from his father, Jacob, nor from his hate-filled brothers, nor from the palace courts of pagan Egypt. These convictions were learned in the presence of God. He not only battled temptation, but he had a battle plan that he would follow as this woman continued to pursue him. And so now it's going to break down verse by verse what Joseph's battle plan was. He had the right concerns, verses 8 and 9. He was concerned ethically that his actions not hurt others, in this case, Potiphar. He had that close relationship. There was no reason he wanted to do anything wrong to Potiphar. Potiphar excelled him above all the others. And this is kind of a trend with Joseph. People hate him, but at the same time, he always gets elevated. And I really think that is because of his testimony. His master had entrusted him with much, and Joseph refused to violate that trust for a moment of pleasure. He also looked beyond the immediate to the ultimate, recognizing the consequences that such sin would have on his relationship with God. He was concerned spiritually because he understood that all sin is against God. The offer of sensual pleasure was not worth the price tag attached to it. Verse 10, he had the right strategy. He avoided contact with Potiphar's wife. Joseph realized that he had to be aware of the lure of sin and avoid its opportunities. He had to be alert and on guard against temptation. And so do we. say if you're busy, it's hard for Satan to get, his foot in the door. But right now, when we're all just kind of sitting at home, watch out, because it's either a verse or a saying. I'd have to look it up. But it said like idle hands make light work or something like that. Basically saying that, if you're just kind of sitting idle, not doing much, which we're all pretty much doing these days, look out, because that's when Satan's like, I got him right where I want him. I can just, just pop some thought in their mind, and who knows what could come from that. But he also had the right escape route, and this is crucial. Verse 12. When Potiphar's wife finally got Joseph alone and boldly tried to lure him, he ran as far as he could or as fast as he could. What Samson, David, and Solomon did not do, Joseph did. He fled, keeping the courage of his convictions and his integrity intact. He exemplified Paul's advice to Timothy. Flee also youthful lusts, 2 Timothy 2:22. He didn't flirt with sin, argue with it, or reason with it. He fled from it. So it's not even like well, I don't know, and then he stopped. It was like, no, he fled right away. The question is, in the face of this persistent temptation and with his limited personal spiritual training, how did Joseph resist? 3 different things. He recognized that he belonged to God. He recognized sin effects on others. He recognized sin as defiance against God. And that's the realization we have to come to. Sometimes you may be thinking, I don't know, is this right or wrong? Because some things are just kind of undefined. And my thing has always been, if you think it's wrong, it probably is. But, it never hurts to ask, because there may be someone who knows. But, that's when we pray in things, to seek that guidance from God. Like, God, is this right? I just need some clarification. But this young man's godly character was continuing to be shaped. In a perfect world, or on a 30-minute television sitcom, his steadfast convictions would have resulted in everyone living happily ever after. But real life doesn't operate that way. Life in a fallen world seldom rewards right living. And that's why it's so important that we do. But then there's the power of revenge. Joseph has resisted the temptation to this point. So Satan has to get him somehow. Joseph had a strategy for maintaining his purity, but Potiphar's wife had a strategy as well. Obviously, she was not accustomed to being refused what she wanted. She began by flattering him. After all, Joseph was in charge of everything else that was Potiphar's. Why not enjoy her as well? When he refused, she tried to wear him down, offering herself to him day after day after day. When that failed, she tried to ambush him and force herself upon him. That level of desperation reveals how determined she was to have him as her own. Joseph, though, was ruled by principles. But Potiphar's wife was ruled by passion. And that's kind of a thing. Remember, I talked about patience on Sunday. It's principles versus passion. And, that's kind of the exciting thing. It's when we have that patience that principles come by. Passion is just acting in the moment, and that's what Potiphar's wife was doing. And so when she was rebuffed, her passions exploded in anger and revenge. She lied about Joseph to the men of the household, using her abandoned coat as evidence against him. The second time a coat had been used in a lie about Joseph. And she lied about Joseph to her husband. In ancient Egypt, the penalty for adultery was 1,000 lashes. Ouch. But the penalty for rape was death. And remember, it's possible that Potiphar was the chief executioner. It's also possible that he knew his wife was lying. At the very least, he knew that such an accusation was out of character for this young man. But desperate to save face, Potiphar had Joseph imprisoned. Joseph ended up in jail for doing the right thing. We protest. It isn't fair. Why does that happen? And that's true. Often, life isn't fair. But our responsibility is to do right and leave the consequences to God. Joseph had responded properly to his enslavement and to his temptation. How would he respond to this unjust imprisonment? How would you and I respond? I know personally, I'd be like, this isn't right. I didn't do anything. Why would God let this happen to me when, all I did was flee from the temptation? But at the same time, we have to realize we're going to come out of this better. That's the difference between passion and principles. Because in a passionate, just top of the head thought, I'd be thinking, seriously, this is happening? And I'd get angry, and that's it. But that's where patience comes in, because the principles come in after that. And so with your principles, you would realize, hey, maybe I hope God's going to turn this around because I did the right thing. So I'm going to let him be the final judge. Like we said Sunday, just give it to God. And that's true. Often life isn't fair, but our responsibility is to do right and leave the consequences to God. Joseph had responded properly to his enslavement and to his temptation. How would he respond to this unjust imprisonment? The presence of God comes in this point. Once again, Joseph found comfort in the presence of God. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. It would have been natural for Joseph to think, why be good and do right if I just end up in here? But Joseph didn't. Instead, he rested in God's presence and God blessed him, even in prison. Once again, he learned what it meant to overcome in the midst of the pains, problems, dangers, and tests of life. All these things come into focus when we view them through the lens of God's sovereign purpose. Then we can trust his will and know his mercy. Joseph's character was under construction as he was shaped by adversity, punished by men, and honored by God. Genesis 39 ends the way it began, with Joseph in bondage. Yet through it all, his solid faith in God's control had helped him overcome. And what was the first verse in our text on Sunday? The end of a thing is better than the beginning. You look at what happened here with Joseph, and you say, how's it any better? It's the same. He started this in bondage, and he's still in bondage, just in a different way. And so you think to yourself, how is that better? Because God has shown mercy on him. And you're going to see next week, God's glory really shows through him. And you really get to see him be redeemed. He comes out of this way on top, more than you would expect. And so this week, I would just encourage you to remember that passion versus principle aspect, and to work together for that good.